As IDRA celebrates such an important milestone, we pay tribute to our founder, Dr. José A. Cárdenas, whose legacy is the driving force behind the school funding fellowship that's in his name, that was created by the IDRA Board of Directors in 2013 in collaboration with then IDRA President, Dr. Maria Robledo Montesel. And I would like to just say thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm so glad that y'all are joining. I know there's still some people joining us, and so we will go ahead and get started, but I appreciate everybody being here. The goal of this School Finance Fellowship that is named after our founder, Dr. Cárdenas, is to engage the nation's most promising researchers in investigating school finance solutions that secure equity and excellence for all public school students. When people try to rationalize funding inequity by claiming that money doesn't matter, Dr. Cárdenas would ask, well, you know, if money doesn't matter so much, can we have some of yours? And you know, that's, I think that kind of real talk really brought in a lot of people that were not familiar with the very complicated world of school funding. You know, we just celebrated at IDRA our 50th. We commemorated the 50th anniversary of the infamous U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Rodriguez versus San Antonio ISD. And in that, around that time, Dr. Cárdenas served as the superintendent of Edgewood ISD, and he played a key role in that case. He also served as an expert witness in that case and trained IDRA's former director of policy, Dr. Albert Cortez, and others at IDRA to do the same in the subsequent line of what we call the Edgewood cases. Those cases were here in Texas. They led to pivotal progress in how Texas funds its schools. And those cases were brought by MALDEF and its lead counsel at the time, Al Kaufman, who actually is one of our advisory committee members. And Al used to like to say that in litigation, he would do whatever Dr. Cárdenas told him to do. And he was joking, but in truth, Dr. Cárdenas's research, his articles, his books really provided a blueprint for those who are interested in bringing about reform in schools and in other institutions. And his unwavering dedication to educational equity really laid the foundation for our mission at IDRA. 5 decades later, we build upon his remarkable work and we recommit to his vision of ensuring that all students, regardless of their life circumstances, attend strong public schools that have resources and opportunities for their success. So why are we here today? Y'all are all here for the School Funding and Research Symposium. Our symposium has a really exciting lineup of panelists and participants from across the nation to engage in critical conversations about school funding and educational equity. And what an important time for us to do this, right? Just as here in this state where IDRA was founded, in Texas and in other states like Georgia, where we do our work, state leaders are pushing private school vouchers. I like to call it the Texas 3-step, where politicians seek to divest, demonize, and privatize public schools by proposing tax cuts for the wealthy in the form of private school vouchers, which make school funding systems even more inequitable. Just this week, our governor here in Texas stepped up pressure on the Texas House of Representatives to pass a voucher bill and threatened a special session if he didn't get his way. What we saw was incredible. We saw tens of thousands of educators, students, and families make their voice heard against vouchers, even though they were shut out of public testimony in a hearing of the Texas House Public Education Committee. And we know here, particularly where IDRA was founded in San Antonio, communities have resisted for decades, and we won't stop because places like Texas and Georgia are our homes. We're not going to leave, and our students deserve better. So thank you to those who are just joining us. Today, we have curated a program that brings together scholars, practitioners, and advocates in the field of education finance. We have had 5 school finance fellows since the fellowship was created. And today, 2 of our fellows, Dr. Vanessa Sansone and Dr. David Martinez, will present their research. Dr. Sansone, an assistant professor of higher education at the University of Texas at San Antonio in its Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies, will present her study that examined CARES Act funding and spending patterns among HSIs, Hispanic-serving institutions in Texas, and then we'll follow that with the panel discussion. Next, Dr. Martinez, assistant professor at the University of South Carolina's Department of Educational Leadership, will present his analysis of South Carolina school finance priorities in high proportion Latinx school districts during the pandemic, again, followed by a panel discussion. And last but not least, we will have a very exciting presentation by a team of high school students on the results of their youth participatory action research. The students are also inaugural members of IDRA's Youth Advisory Board in 2022. And we established that to better engage students to center their needs, their lived experiences, and their dreams into the work that IDRA does. They presented at IDRA's first ever National Youth Summit held earlier this year, and you won't want to miss their panel. So before we get started with our first panel, I'd like to thank the unmatchable IDRA team for making this happen, especially to Michelle Vega, Christy Goodman, Dr. Joanna Sánchez, Dr. Chloe Latham-Sykes, and Morgan Craven, whose birthday is today. Happy birthday. And I want to express my gratitude for the guidance and expertise of the fellow programs advisory committee members who are joining us today: Dr. Jaime Chahín, Dr. Albert Cortés, Dr. Edward Garcia Fierros, Al Kaufman, and IDRA President Emerita, Dr. Maria Robledo Montesel. So welcome again. For those who are just joining us, we're about to dive into our first research presentation by Dr. Vanessa Sansone, again, an assistant professor of higher ed at UTSA. She holds a doctorate in educational leadership with an emphasis in higher education, and look forward to hearing about your research. I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Sansone.
Thank you very much, Celina. Thank you, everyone. And I just want to echo the gratitude that I have for the IDRA team and the esteemed reviewers. I very much enjoyed being a part of the IDRA familia. So I am going to share my screen to get into this presentation. And I'm going to minimize. Okay. So the Finance Fellowship allowed me to, as Celina mentioned, explore the CARES Act funding, particularly with regards to how it affected Hispanic-serving institutions in Texas. I do have a Twitter account. Feel free to tweet out anything or engage with me there. I am there for now. We'll see as time goes on with Twitter. So before we get going into the report that I have, which will be available if it's not available right now on this research, I thought I'd take a moment to educate or reintroduce you to what are Hispanic serving institutions in the US. My training is not only in higher education, but it's also in demography. And so I really love maps. So here is a map of all the HSIs in the United States. And so where you see the blue dots are the federally classified HSIs, where you see the blue dots are what we call emerging HSIs. And to give you the definition of what a HSI in the United States is it is a federal classification, and it is based on an enrollment criterion of 25% full-time equivalent undergraduate students who identify as Latino and also low income. And that those two components are really important to the federal definition. Sometimes a lot of folks forget about the low income piece and just focus on the enrollment, but it's enrollment and low income. So currently right now from the data of Excelencia, in 2021, 2022, there are currently 571 Hispanic serving institutions in the US, and there are 401 emerging, meaning they're on the cusp of meeting one of those markers there of the 25% FTE and low income. So there's quite a bit of HSIs with the expectation that many more will be eligible and become a federally classified HSI. What's really important though to understanding this is that currently right now there are 1.37 million Latinos at the undergraduate level who are attending school at a federally identified Hispanic serving institution, which means that 62% of all Latino undergraduates are enrolled and being served at a Hispanic serving institution. But coincidentally, only 19% of all institutions of higher education in the US are federally classified as HSI. So I like to frame it in this way, that there are only 19% of all institutions in the US who are educating 62% of all Latino undergraduates in the US, which is a very striking statistic when you think about it. I do want to mention too how you're seeing demographic, in this map here, you're seeing where these HSIs are located and how with those emerging, right, the ones that are emerging, it's just not in Texas, it's just not in California, Florida, New York. HSIs are coming all over the US. For example, when I first started getting into this work, I didn't realize how often I'd be going to the Midwest to talk about HSIs. So it's just something that, is coming up more and more. And then I also want to point on the very corner here is Puerto Rico, which we tend to forget sometimes, but Puerto Rico is a part of the HSI landscape with almost, I think, like 99.9% of their institution of higher education being federally classified as a Hispanic serving institution. So that is the quick intro for HSIs. I also want to go ahead and set the landscape and the context for why this is important, particularly with regards to this fellowship relating to equity. So, when I do this work, I tend to always get asked about discussing about the racial component, but there's really intersecting identities when we think about the empirical work and the characteristics of students at HSIs. Race is a part of it, with serving a large proportion of Latinos, but it's not the only component. Excuse me, earpiece fell out. A lot of the HSIs in the U.S. are also first in their families to go to college. They also have high financial need, and they tend to enroll in K through 12 schools and systems that have less resources, which mean that they tend to be less academically prepared for college in comparison to affluent, predominantly white K through 12 schools. So I want to make sure that that's known, because it's not through any fault of their own, it's systemic. But of course, Latinos are not the only ones who are attending HSIs. There's a large proportion of students from racialized backgrounds, including Southeast Asian, as well as Black Americans. So Latinos, based on this definition, are a big part of it, but it really does encompass other racialized, underserved students in the US. So HSIs are serving some of the most underserved populations in the country. And again, race is a part of it, but there are other intersecting identities to think about. So we are talking about finance today, And my fellowship also focused on finance. So I thought I would also give you some brief introduction into setting the financial context of HSIs in the US. When compared to what we call predominantly white institutions in the US, which are the majority of institutions out there, when you look at the finances, we see that when compared to predominantly white institutions, HSIs receive 66 cents per federal dollar given to non-HSIs or PWIs. So I just, just in case that's not, in your as visual, right? I just like to show my students, think of that dollar bill, right? We try to stretch that dollar bill from the federal government. Well, when you give that to, let's say, Texas A&M, or let's say Harvard, that dollar goes all the way. But when you give that same dollar to an HSI, only 66 cents is really given, because there's so much additional needs that HSIs have to cover financially. A big part of it is related to the screen that I just came from, because they're serving a large proportion of students who are coming to campus who need additional resources. So like I mentioned, the first in their family, they have more financial need. That comes into needing some more support services. So more advisors, more tutors, right? More classes that can help with onboarding in some of these cases. So with regards to the finances, HSIs are receiving less, but are expected to pay for more, essentially. At the same time, HSIs also charge lower tuition in comparison to predominantly white institutions. So their streams of resources, which we're going to get into in just a moment, is a lot less. They have less access to streams of revenue. Sorry, I said resources. Revenue is what I meant to say. And that's because most of the students that they're serving, again, they're thinking about whether they can afford it or not. The other thing too is that because of these components that I'm mentioning, HSIs tend to rely more on federal government revenue and also state revenue, so state appropriations essentially. So when I get to talking about this with my students or audience members like yourselves, I like to say that when incidents happen where the state or the federal government reduces sources of support, financial sources of support, it creates a cold for the highly selective flagship predominantly white institutions. But for HSIs, that creates pneumonia. So think about that financial context as we get into some of the things that I found. This is just giving an overview of some of the ways that revenues and the areas of revenues that not just HSIs, but also minority serving institutions in general in comparison to state flagships and research institutions, just giving you a visual difference. I don't want to spend too much time on it because it was just meant to show you that across many areas of revenue, you can see how there's inequity already systemically in play with the way that we fund higher education institutions in the US. So really, with setting this context, I just want to make it pretty clear that HSIs are organizationally different from other HSIs, which I'll get into in just a moment. But most important, they're organizationally different when compared to predominantly white institutions. I have to emphasize that because oftentimes I get pushback from colleagues across the country that like to say, well, HSI started as predominantly white institutions because historically this federal classification didn't happen until the 90s, but the work began in the 70s. And so, considering the establishing years for many institutions across the country, including those that are federally classified as HSIs, yes, they were predominantly white institutions, but despite that, there is organizational difference, which is why we had advocates beginning in the 70s who pushed for additional funding. So let me bring you to today with regards to HSI finance and thinking about the CARES Act. To refresh your memory, I want to give you just a brief policy overview of the HSI HERF funds, the CARES Act HERF funds. I only looked at the first round of HERF funding because there have been 3 rounds actually with CARES Act HERF funds. And HERF funds in particular are related to higher education because if you all recall, with the pandemic, CARES Act was the federal relief support that went to many organizations and areas of our society, including healthcare, including, you know, K through 12 education, right? But HERF funds in particular were specifically to support higher education and students enrolled at the time that the pandemic happened. So with regards to this particular policy, it was designed with 3 things in mind, and I have them listed there. I'm going to actually go to the right first, if you don't mind. So there was an institutional component where funds could be awarded to institutions, regardless of designation, that could be spent towards institutional capacities. So you got a pot of money with this line, budget line, you can think about it. Another budget line was a student set aside with the policy design. That meant that the federal government was going to give an institution money for its students, but those funds had to be spent and directed to students. It could not be spent towards anything else. The third line was it considered minority serving institutions. This was a really unique thing about the CARES Act, HERF funds, because previously when we thought about HSI finance, most financing came from external funding through federal agencies. So basically writing a grant that was specific to you being an HSI and applying and being one. But this actually gave direct allocation to support federally defined minority serving institutions, which included Hispanic serving institutions. So in other words, anybody who is classified as a Hispanic serving institution received an additional line of money. So based on this context, I was really interested in exploring a couple of things. The first was I wanted to understand how the CARES Act, HERF funds was dispersed to HSIs, and I selected some HSIs in particular. And then I also wanted to know how they were used by these HSIs. And then how did HSIs navigate state and federal funding systems and policies, including those barriers faced and overcame by the HSI campuses in thinking about their short-term and long-term financial sustainability, not only for themselves as institutions and organizations, but also thinking about their students with regards to, you know, the uncertainty that the pandemic, you know, put in place for all of us. So these were the 3 areas that I explored. You know, I wanted to focus in as an exploratory study on 10 HSIs, and I chose Texas. Why? I guess one, probably because I'm a bit biased. I'm here, I'm interested, but also in that biases that I'm sharing with you. Texas is a really good case study for the demographics and the way that the nation is going. So Texas is a really good starting point to this conversation about CARES Act, HERF funds, and HSIs, and knowing how you know, it supported, in particular, Latino students, but also students of color. So I looked at a number of publicly available data, including CARES Act funding reports, because that was a federal requirement and is publicly available even now. I looked at also state legislative appropriation request report, AKA law reports, to also understand how institutions were asking the state for money with regards to what was going on. I also looked at other legislative documents, testimony, media, institutional websites, as well as any data to describe the context of the area that the HSI was situated within during that time. So a lot of the data from that came from the US Census Bureau. I did use theory to guide my analysis. I used 2 theories, as a matter of fact. The first one was resource dependency theory. which is an organizational theory that basically says that organizations who are more dependent on resources, like from the government, will make decisions based on making sure that those lines of revenue still come. But I also expanded this because, quite frankly, it's a very Eurocentric way of thinking, resource dependency theory. And if I'm really considering Hispanic-serving institutions and Latino students, as well as underrepresented students, to me that wasn't enough. And so I began to look at Chicana feminist literature, policy, and finance, and I brought forth the concept of movidas. So I'm still defining what movidas is, but to me, movidas is more than just the translation of it, which are move strategies. It's organizations being innovative with that dollar, right? How do we stretch that dollar more than what we do? So movidas are those moves and strategies of innovation with regards to finance and thinking how we can not only survive, but also thrive in the limited finance that we have. So here are some of my findings, and I'll walk you through each of them. I did have 4 findings. So the first finding that I had is with regards to that there are variations in regional contexts and student populations. So this data came from the various sources that I mentioned, including iPads, as well as the state information on Texas higher education institutions. And what you begin to see with considering the Census Bureau data is that this idea that HSIs, are serving a particular type of student or in particular types of communities, it's not homogenous. It's actually varies. So institutions right off the top for me that were very much interesting was, for example, Texas State University, where they're serving, 41, an area that has 41% of Latino population. But their median household is 71,000. They have a place where there's, a lot of folks who don't have insurance, right? So it really contextualizes a lot of who these institutions are serving beyond just their students and thinking about those communities. With the students, though, you begin to see that it's not just Latinos. I point to the University of Houston downtown that has 18% of their population that is Black. So again, HSIs are not just serving Latinos, they're serving a wide breadth of historically underserved populations and communities. The second research question also addressed that variation source of funding sources with regards to dollar amount. You began to get a clearer picture of what each institution is working with. You see on the screen, I want to point to that first column there, the University of Texas at Austin, because University of Texas of Austin is an HSI, federally classified HSI, but it is our flagship, our highly selective flagship. University of Texas at Austin is a really good example of how this HSI identity gets really complicated, because although they're meeting that criterion, they are one of the most financially secure institutions in the country. They rival Harvard, who has $1 billion endowment for, the largest endowment in the country. The University of Texas Austin rivals it and has aspirations and plans to overtake Harvard as having the #1 source of revenue and endowment in the country. And I don't doubt they will accomplish that. So they are, if you will, my comparison to thinking about the other HSIs. You'll also notice that if you scroll down, there's an area for Federal CARES Act, her funds spent. You'll see that University of Texas is blank there. And that's because at the time they were not classified as an HSI. So they did not receive that additional MSI source of revenue through the CARES HERF Act. The other ones did. What you began to see from this though is that, goodness, like it's a hodgepodge with regards to how these institutions bring in revenue, but also the types of expenses. The biggest thing with regards to core expenses is that a lot of these HSIs are spending a lot of money on academic support and instruction and research. So that makes sense when we think about the empirical literature and the characteristics of the students that I mentioned, that it costs more for an institution to serve their students in these areas, given what I just mentioned a few slides ago. So it's costing a lot more money, yet they're, although ambitious with the CARES Act and helpful, we'll see on this next slide how they're actually using these particular funds to serve students. And this one is the percentage. I'm going to skip forward. So considering Movidas as my framework, I wanted to know how each HSI was spending, because if you recall from the way that the policy was designed, HSIs with their institutional pool of money could use that in whatever capacity that they need. So broadly speaking, they could have used it in any which way they wanted to. But what I began to see using the Movidas, I began to see how HSIs were actually centering Latino students. These HSIs that I studied were centering the Latino student experience, and thinking about long-term and short-term justice, right? So I was able to classify the ways that they spent the funds in these three buckets here, or these three themes. And one of those ways that I saw that HSIs were using funds that technically they could have used for, I don't know, parking, right? Something like that. They used it in ways where they would limit student debt increases. They also used it in ways where they were using it to supplant the state funding that has not kept pace, and also federal, by the way, that has not kept pace, by using the funds to update the infrastructure like broadband, as well as all the technology that was needed when we pivoted online. Because a lot of these HSIs did not have it. Honestly, we're not ready for that pivot. We're still doing things face to face, and now you ask us to do this online. I don't have the IT folks who can do this. And so they were using it in ways where they really thought about how do we close these instructional resources and infrastructure gaps that were in play before the pandemic. They also thought about students by providing access to wellness services. So paying for, testing, right? The COVID tests, but they also were thinking about all of the impacts of the pandemic mentally and wellness wise. So these HSIs that I studied began to give free counseling and therapy services. For example, one HSI in my sample paid for the license of an online therapy, where students who were enrolled could access through their logon, right, their student logon, and sign up to talk to an online therapist for free at any point in time. These were things that were not offered before, but using the CARES Act funds, these HSIs in my sample did just that. But I also wanted to understand, in thinking about how they were using these funds, some ways that maybe weren't so great, or ways that could have been better. So when I began to think about Latinos and the pandemic and center things like long-term, short-term justice practices, I began to see how the ways that these HSIs were making decisions about the CARES Act funding was that they actually were marginalizing more students who were always at the margins of affordability. So who am I specifically talking to? I'm talking about dreamer students. I'm also talking about graduate students. Many of these HSIs were using the submission of a FAFSA application as their form of justifying whether these students would receive the federal CARES Act funds that they could send out. They were also using things like full-time enrollment. So again, that was, essentially discriminating against part-time students. And they were, using ways of including students also by thinking about whether they were just worthy. So some of these institutions required applications to just, say like, hey, tell us how you need it. So it really, they began to take on, ways that weren't great, basically, and began to marginalize the students that they serve that already marginalized in higher ed. The other thing that I found was that the HSIs lacked documenting, reporting, and self-advocating for the great work that they were doing with these funds. Why does that matter? To me, that matters significantly because they were being innovative. They're being very innovative in the ways that they were giving out funding, but not documenting or reporting beyond the minimal federal requirement that they had to do with their online reporting. Will say there's one exception to this, which actually is my home institution, University of Texas San Antonio, who still has a website that told a lot of stories about how they made decisions about where the funding goes. And quite honestly, it made them, to me at least, it made them look really good because a lot of the stuff that they were doing demonstrated how they were intentional about their Latino students and their communities and coming up with innovative ways to use the funds to support the students, not just through the pandemic, but beyond. So based on this collective findings, what did we learn, or what did I learn, and I'm sharing with you all? This study really begins to give us a foundational knowledge from the sample of HSIs that I looked at about how HSIs make decisions using finances, but also consider the needs of their students. This is significant because there's very few studies that think about HSIs and HSI finance and HSI leadership financial decision making. So this is a very new and good, I think, contribution to this body of work that is very limited. I also found that HSIs use these monies mostly in ways to address the financial equities that were in place before, but also the financial hardships that were brought upon the pandemic, not only to the institution, but to their students and the communities that they serve. And it really did consider these short and long-term needs of students. Think, for example, not just, considering the wellness, that has long-term support and can lead to long-term success, not just getting them through the pandemic at that time. All these implications also demonstrate that, that students, financial capacities, all of it matters. And to me, this also begins to speak of state and federal partnerships, because essentially that's what this was. The CARES Act HERF funds was a design of a state federal partnership, and how this can be something that addresses financial inequities and affordability in college. So what can we learn about the application for this, though, in state, not just understanding, what beyond what I learned here, but I think the big thing is that HSIs are distinct institutional types. There's variation within, but also in comparison to predominantly white institutions. And that's going to be very important when we think about equity and financial equity in higher education. I also think that there's an application for this in terms of creating finance designs, college financial designs that you can allocate direct funds to HSIs, like the way that the CARES Act HERF funds did, because we did see how they used it in ways that not only mattered, but were intentional about supporting. A lot of the argument tends to be like, oh, we can't give institutions the funds because they're going to use it in wrong ways. So we give it only to students, for example, the federal Pell, right? And it's not to say that we need to take that away. By no means, we actually need to increase that. But we can also think about allocating funds to the institution to address this broader issue of college affordability. But within that, we must keep in mind that, if we work on this, particularly with regard to a state-federal partnership, that it's not to supplant. So in other words, the state can't say, oh, okay, well, the federal government's giving you this money, so we don't need to give it to you. That's not what needs to happen. There also needs to be some consideration about the required maintenance of effort, because again, we see that these are distinct institutional types. So if we think about this from a federal lens, certain states are doing different things and shouldn't be penalized for already supporting HSIs in an equity-based way. The policy design really did work, though. With the student institutional set-asides, I do think in what I learned that there might be better implementation guidelines, because as I mentioned, the design of the policy basically said, use it as you will, right? So institutions weren't really sure and weren't prepared to do the most effective, things with the funds. They did the best that they could, but what could be better is implementation guidelines. And the federal government should continue to require the reporting procedures that are already in place right now for those institutions who are accepting direct relief funds. But I think there needs to be some consideration of more reporting beyond what is already required. The exemplar in this sample is the University of Texas at San Antonio, who still has an active website on this, who still is talking about those unique ways, and they're documenting the long-term success, because a lot of what the institutions are doing is that they showed this, right? Or they did these wonderful things, but in not documenting, we don't know and can't tell policymakers that this led to graduation, right? This led to them staying persistent in their enrollment. And that's something that's on HSIs and HSL leadership there. But in terms of the policy design, it could be better, because the design, as I mentioned, focused on full-time equivalency and did not consider part-time students. So given that HSIs have a large proportion of part-time students, it actually, didn't support those institutions that it was intended to support in the way that it should. So there should be a consideration of headcount instead of full-time equivalent. So I want to thank you for your time and me going through my Dr. José Cárdenas Finance Fellowship and what I learned about the HSI CARES Act. I look forward to your questions and thank the panelists in advance for their feedback and questions on this study.
Thank you, Dr. Sansone, for that really important work. Now I'd like to bring in our panelists to get their take on your findings. Joining you on the panel are Dr. Jaime Chahín, who is an advisory committee member of this School Finance Fellowship, and Dr. Joanna Sánchez. I'll take a brief moment to introduce them, and we'll also put their full bios in the chat. And speaking of the chat, if y'all have questions, please add them to the chat, and we will do our best to get to them. So Dr. Jaime Chahín is a professor and dean of the College of Applied Arts at Texas State University, an HSI. He has taught undergrad and grad courses in education and social work policy, and Dean Chahín served as a lead expert witness in LULAC v. Richards, which is the class action lawsuit brought by MALDEF that led to significant changes in higher ed funding in South Texas along the border. Our own Dr. Joanna Sánchez, IDRA senior policy researcher, who develops relevant and timely data analysis, visualizations, and research, is also joining the panel, and she's an expert in GIS and spatial analysis in education. She previously served as chief of staff and vice president for research at Excelencia in education, and some of the work that was referenced, she played a huge role in producing that work. So I'm really excited for our panel. Dr. Chahín, I want to get your take on Dr. Sansone's findings, but first just want to take a step back. As Dean of the College of Applied Arts and a longtime professor at an HSI in Texas, can you give us your perspective on the funding levels of HSIs through the years? Have they decreased or remained stagnant? And do you see hope for us moving forward toward a more equitable funding system for HSIs and other MSIs?
The key to the equitable funding question of, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. The key to the equitable funding question of HSIs is academic programs. In Texas, they fund you by formula funding, by whether you have a Ph.D., a master's, or an undergrad. So that automatically creates inequities depending on the mission of the institution. If I look at the mission of the institutions that were included in this project, there's a wide range from University of Houston downtown to us. We only have 13 doctoral programs. UTSA probably has 20 something. UT Austin is a research one, comprehensive research university. So even though they have demographically been defined as Hispanic-serving institutions, they're totally different. The other aspect is first generation and Pell Grant recipients. It varies by institutions because the point that Vanessa made that the population is heterogeneous is true. Latinos are not a homogeneous population. Latinos in the UTRGV are different than UTEP or UT Austin or Texas State or UTSA. So the problem is very, very complex. The CARES Act awarded one-time money to these institutions to see what they would do. And naturally, the biggest challenge was the cost of education for the students and their borrowing loans. I noticed that Vanessa made a comment that the funds actually reduced the borrowing of students. Am I correct, Vanessa, to reach your that? So that has implications that funding makes a difference. Let me give you an example. We had $4 million from a USDA grant, and we gave 56 students from Laredo tuition and fees for 4 years. 96% graduated in 4 years. When our regular 4-year graduation rate at Texas State is 34% graduate in 4 years. But we noticed that when you intervene with funding, targeted funding, intentional funding, and additional support, computers and everything, you're more successful, whether they're Latino students or not. So that's the biggest challenge. But my observations of this study is that this is one-time funding. How efficiently did you use your resources, and how did the student benefit? And that's the big question for HSIs. Those are my brief comments.
And do you think that HSIs and other MSIs will revert back to the way things were, or do you think some of the changes they implemented during the pandemic will be made permanent, will be institutionalized?
That's an interesting question because their funding sources haven't changed. The majority of the operational budgets come from formula and student tuition and appropriations. That hasn't changed. As a matter of fact, there is in the Texas legislature a bill right now that community colleges are going to be funded on outcome. Outcome, how many degrees they award, how many transfer to university accept. That's pretty complex. That would be very challenging to a university if that was the law, but it's not. But the formula funding, I'm in favor of undergraduate education being funded higher than graduate education, but that's not going to happen because the research professors and everybody that gets paid with the graduate programs, they get more funding appropriated from the state. So therefore, the universities are going to promote graduate education versus undergrad to a larger extent.
No, and Dr. Sánchez, you've done such important work around the growth of HSIs. From your perspective, what do those growth trends look like here in Texas?
So yes, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to join you all today. In regard to the growth trend of HSIs in Texas, as Dr. Sansone shared, our colleagues at Excelencia in Education put out a list of HSIs in the United States and Puerto Rico every year. This latest one that just got published 2 months ago has 571 HSIs in total, we know, within this area. And 101 of them are actually in Texas. So that's about 18% of all HSIs are actually in our state, which is a significant amount. Just 10 years ago, 66 of those HSIs were in Texas. And then 5 years ago, it was 90. And this trajectory has just been upward, since its inception 25 years ago. But during the pandemic was the first time that we actually saw a dip in the number of HSIs, including in Texas. So of the 101 that we have currently, 42 are public 4 years. So that's 10 of the 42 that Dr. Sansone looked at in her study. 33 are public 2 years. 24 are private 4 years, and 2 are private 2 years. So the bounce back that happened in this last year was really in the 4-year category, with the number of public 4 years going from 40 to 42, and the number of private 4 years growing from 20 to 24. Basically, what this is showing is that Latinos are enrolling in all 4 types of institutions, making it very important that these institutions are not just enrolling them, as we saw, but that they're actually being very intentional and meeting students where they're at and supporting them to successfully complete their college education and beyond, which is what we know we're talking about here today. And again, this is something that Dr. Sansone found in her research. And the last data point is also something that Dr. Sansone mentioned, which was emerging HSIs. And as we've seen, those are growing. There's 401 currently, and there's 36 in Texas. And so what this basically tells us is that, yes, it's very important that all of these institutions, HSIs, EHSIs, or all institutions of higher ed support and be very intentional in serving their students. But in regards to HSIs, there's a real financial consequence in regard to how they get funded, because as Dr. Sansone found, HSIs received less funding than non-HSIs based on that FTE count. So that's something to consider, especially for all of our Texas institutions.
And Dr. Sánchez, to your point, where can these EHSIs and HSIs go? What can you share with us some available resources that they can use to gain a better understanding of those students that are enrolling and how they can best serve them?
So yes, so having worked for Excelencia for 4 years, I saw firsthand how the use of the Seal of Excelencia framework was something that came very in handy to institutions who were committed to serving their Latino students through institutional transformation. And this meant that it was helpful whether they were an HSI or not. And the framework was looking at the institutional capacity to intentionally serve students beyond enrollment. So the way this framework works is that it looked at 3 components: data, practice, and leadership. And all of these things are things that Dr. Sansone mentioned and referenced as being pivotal in some of the way that the 10 institutions that she looked at address the needs of their Latino students. In regards to this framework, the area that it focuses on is in regard to data and practices regarding enrollment, retention, transfer in and out, financial support, representation, and degree completion of Latino students. So being very intentional about looking at data and looking at data disaggregated over the course of 5 years in this case. And as it has been mentioned, the key part of all of this is tying in that leadership component, which is not just about the president, but at the institutional level, from HR departments, communications, institutional culture, and the mission and the strategy of the institution. So having worked there and been part of that team, we heard countless times from institutions who would say that the framework had been very helpful in terms of them doing an internal assessment and trying to understand and, in a tangible way, how they were supporting their Latino students at their institution. And whether they applied for the certification or not, it was still helpful because this framework is broad enough where it can be applied to an institution, be it public, private, 2-year, or 4-year. So it was really interesting in terms of listening to Dr. Sansone, because it brings it full circle, because several of the HSIs that she researched are actually SEAL certified institutions. So I hope, again, this is not the only framework out there. It's just one that I know personally. and I have seen actually in action and help to be helpful. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dr. Sanchez, and Dr. Sansone. I want to invite you to respond to some of that feedback. I know you shared your research and your feedback from with some of the institutions that were part of the study, and I'm really curious what feedback you got. And it would also be great to hear tangible ways that you think that all of us can put into the hands, all of the research that you shared for the symposium, can put those findings into the hands of stakeholders, policymakers, and constituents, so that they can act upon this research.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the comments and feedback. I'm learning from you both, so thank you. But in speaking with HSI leadership, I think it gets at the heart of what our discussants have expressed. The use of wanting to serve students best also requires money, and I think I go back and I'm learning. So particularly like I'm thinking of Morgan and Celina, who we're JDs on this. I'm thinking about the separate but unequal, and how that mainly has discussed K-12, which is important and matters. But I think we're starting to see this more and more in higher education. This research has really illuminated it, because again, the current research that's out there focuses on a servingness framework, which really looks at how do HSIs best serve Latino students. But, and I can speak to this because it is a framework that I co-authored. The servingness framework doesn't really bring in finances. It kind of just touches and says that finances matter, which we know. But how does it actually matter? And then when you receive funding, how are you using it in those ways? So some of the things that the leadership and the folks that I spoke with, the biggest thing that I can offer is that they actually wanted to know what other HSIs did. What did you learn that they did? Because this is what we did, but we don't really know if it was the best. It kind of was almost a wild, wild west when the CARES Act, HER funds was given. You're just told to spend. And so people were just spending left and right. They kind of took time to be intentional, and as you can see, but there are other ways, in which it wasn't great. And that was, one of the things that I brought forth. Like I mentioned, totally overlooked dreamers, totally overlooked, graduate students and their particular needs, especially Latino and other historically underrepresented graduate students. And so how can we help and move forward? To me, the biggest thing is, and I said it once, but I think it's worthy of mentioning it again, that HSIs really need to get together to advocate for themselves, both at the federal and state level. And we have wonderful think tanks in place that are helping with that. But there's still something that's missing there. And because when I spoke to the HSI leaders with these federal relief funds that were intentional for them, and a line that said, here you are, there still was a lot of confusion. There still was a lot of misunderstanding about how to use those funds in the most effective ways. They came up with some, and it's clear, and I mentioned some in this discussion here, but also you'll see more details about them in the report, the publicly available report. But it didn't go beyond a slight notation. I thought some of these ways were innovative. I thought some of these ways led to long-term success, like graduating, like not taking on more debt. These are things that policymakers don't know about. And it's up to us to make sure that they understand this. Because if not, then they think that this was a one-off and it won't come back again.
So more movidas correctas and a call to action for more communication and collaboration. Thank you so much. I think we'll end there.